Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Interloops YouTube channel. I'm Kira, and today, as part of our Author's Corner series, I'll be having a conversation with Meg Eden about her new book of poetry, Drowning in the Floating World. For more Meg, you can check out the link in our bio or our website to find articles, interviews, podcasts, and most importantly, a link to purchase the book. So, Meg, the first thing I'd love to talk to you about is the sheer scale of diverse forms in this collection. As James Arthur notes in his review, we have a range of poetic styles, form and free verse, intimate lyrics and found text. We have haiku, we have Yelp reviews. How has your experimentation with form developed?
So I think some people have asked, how do you talk about one thing for a whole book? And I think one of the ways you try and find a lot of different angles to talk about the same thing, or trying to look at the same event from different angles. And I think one of those angles is form. And so when I was trying to figure out different ways to talk about this, or how do I quite get to the heart of what I'm trying to say, I found that forms are a really helpful device for unlocking that. The constraints are very helpful. So I think I played and I saw which forms really fit or worked, and kind of dug with those some more.
Yeah, did you have a sense of beginning with more traditional forms and then getting more experimental over the course of your writing, or did you find yourself jumping around?
Probably jumping around. I mean, I know that triplets and the haiku are really an underlying form here. I love the haiku. When I was taught about it, really in high school, somebody really unlocked for me how each line functions to lead to an aha moment. And so that's something that I was thinking about a lot with this, because I really wanted to just go beyond telling what people knew and beyond the pain of disaster to try and find something, some realization, something beautiful, even in the heartbreaking. So I know that I used a lot of forms that had kind of the haiku and the triplets as like a foundation. But like the Yelp reviews, I think it's just more literal maybe than it seems. It seems very experimental, but it was really just like, I saw that there were Yelp reviews for Fukushima, and I'm just like,
Yeah.
what a weird way to troll, like what a weird way for us to talk about disaster. So I don't think it's necessarily super intentional of like, let me just try these like certain things and now let me just get weirder. I think I was looking at certain objects, like in that section too, there's kind of this chart of debris and things like that. Or actually, I guess it's the next section. But that again was a literal mimicking of a form, that there were literal charts online of all the documentation for objects that were found at sea. And I was just like, that's an interesting way to deal with form, of how the columns kind of are in conversation with each other and reading the literal objects. Like I found poetic aha moments. So then I mimicked that. And of course, also I was in grad school and I was taking forms courses. And so some of it was like, I was having to play with form and hearing about form in new ways and realizing what form can do. And so then I'm like, oh, well, let me try that with this content and see what I discover in the process.
Oh, wow.
If that answers your question.
It does. And that's so interesting. How else would you say your experience in grad school shaped the collection? Was this part of your master's thesis?
So it wasn't quite part of my master's thesis, but I was starting to work on the collection during grad school. The way our program talked about the thesis, they were really trying to stress it's not your first collection, this is just your best work. And I have mixed feelings about that framing. I think there were really good reasons why they do that, because they don't want you to kind of jump the gun. They really just want you to focus on your best poems. So some of the poems that were in my thesis did end up in Drowning. But like what grad school is making me think about, I mean, the MFA program at UMD, they were really trying to hone our craft. And so they were really making us think about craft in really intentional ways. And just one thing I really love about that program is that each of the professors would teach the forms course, and they would each do it differently. So you could take the forms course multiple times and just learn new things about form. And each of them just made me pay attention to different elements of craft or tools in my toolbox that, like I had already taken forms courses before grad school, but now I had more and more ways to think about form and how form can reinforce ideas or pull out certain ideas, and just give me discipline as a writer. So I think that just gave me more possibilities when working on this collection, instead of just writing a bunch of free verse poems that maybe weren't as restrained or controlled as they could have been.
Yeah.
not dissing on free verse, but like it opens possibilities and it makes us have to be tough on ourselves. And that produces creativity and it produces realizations. So
yeah, absolutely. So there are images in this collection that you often return to: boats atop buildings, the opening and entering of corpses, rising tides, devastating water. Part of the deeply moving experience of reading these poems is coming back to these images in new and newly devastating ways and exploring the same disasters from different perspectives, as we've talked about. Do you often find yourself artistically interested in this kind of visual repetition? And how do you think about writing similar images or scenes in new ways and in new contexts?
That's really interesting that you bring it up. I think haunting is something that happens to all writers. We write in part because we're haunted. Like we just can't stop thinking about something, and certain images will haunt us, and those images will keep coming out until we've kind of like to some level coped that we don't feel like we have to keep writing that. And I think this collection was all the more about haunting and the haunting of this disaster. Since writing it, like I get like I cannot handle films with water in them. I have almost had to step out of theaters and stuff when there is like a huge flooding of water, because it's just working with this stuff and thinking about what's really happened. It's like I can't remove myself from that. And I think it's what we do as writers. We put ourselves in such a place that these things haunt us. So again, I'm not sure how intentionally I was trying to repeat those images. I think those images just haunted me. You look at the footage and you see a boat on top of a building and you go, a boat is not supposed to be on top of a building. Something is very wrong. You can't stop thinking about this. So it ends up coming up in the poems. And I think the washing machine is one that came up. There was an interview where somebody said, you know, the town was like this giant washing machine. And you just think about how people are, and a town is becoming objectified, like clothing in a washing machine. And so, yeah, I don't think I was necessarily thinking. I think now I sometimes more intentionally repeat images sometimes in poems, and I think like, how can I transform that image? But I think with writing this, it was just purely like, I can't stop thinking about this image, and so it just came up multiple times. And I think maybe when you look at a collection as a whole, when you're trying to put that collection together, you see, you know, what images are repeating, and when is it repeating in a way that's saying something new, instead of just, you know, literally saying exactly what another poem did. But there wasn't too much intentionality, I don't think, with this collection with that.
Yeah, and I was like, you do succeed at that. I feel like every time I return to an image, I always felt like it was in a new way that was really stylistically interesting.
Great, thank you.
So this collection is also deeply interested, even as you were just mentioning with the article, in reference and research and history. Many of the poems are explicitly after or inspired by specific figures, quotations, news articles, and the reader has access to so much of your inspiration. I was delighted to turn to the back of the book and have you be like, here's everything I'm writing about. Please, like, I encourage you to read more about it on your own. How do you see your art interacting with what you read? And how do you see your reader interacting with these texts?
Well, so let me first address the section in the back, because I got at least one criticism where somebody was like, oh, the writer's trying to show off that they did all this research and it's really off-putting. But I loved this collection was accepted with Press 53's Immersion series. And so something that the editor, Chris Forrest, really wanted was to be able to educate the reader and for it to be really like a learning experience. So that was something we both wanted, was like you're saying, that the reader can, you know, kind of continue this journey afterwards to research and really see the stuff that I used. And so that was like an intentional part. And I'm happy that, especially because disaster comes and goes and people hear it in the news briefly, but they often don't know the extent of everything. There's so many complexities with this disaster, and so many ways that this is a warning of how our governments work and how they kind of can be nonchalant to the populations that can be affected by certain, you know, profitable industries. So I did want to say that that's one thing that we really valued about this collection, and that's something I hope for the readers, is that they can, you know, read the poems and they can get a little bit more than maybe the news was talking about these disasters, and remember it, of course, because, you know, it went out of the news cycle. If you don't live in Japan or you're not interacting with people in Japan, maybe this is something that just kind of came and went in your memory, but I think it's important that we memorialize and remember and learn from disaster. But I do hope also that readers, it won't just come and go in the poems, but, you know, that they can do that research and kind of dig in more for what aspects, you know, perhaps interest them. So that's something about what I hope the reader would take away. And for me with research, that was just such a critical way for me to be, getting material and trying to figure out how to talk about this. Could you remind me the beginning of your question? Because I think I got really excited about the second half. But I wanted to
yes. So that's an excellent idea of how the reader's interacting. How do you see your art interacting with what you read? I feel like you're deeply inspired by the things that you come across in like a news article way, not necessarily other pieces of poetry.
Yeah, I mean, I just I'm not fully sure how to answer that, because I think everything I write is in response. I'm always reading, always trying to fill up my tank, and always trying to keep an eye out for what interests me. And I think all of us as writers should do that, of just constantly consuming discerningly, and seeing, what speaks to me, what do I have something I can add on to and write about. So research is just a constant part of my process. I think for this collection especially, I really wanted to do respect to the content, and I really wanted to learn more about it than just what I had known, from being in Japan and things like that. And, when I needed more poems, I was constantly, trying to decide what other angles can I research from this. But I'm not sure what to say beyond that. Just, I think all of us should be constantly researching and exploring. It's a way for us to get material to write about and to expand what we write about. I think all of us as humans and writers should always be learning, always trying to learn more than our perspective, and that's just going to make us richer human beings as well as richer writers.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'd like to reiterate my delight with the section. I think both of those things came through for me. As like a reader of poetry, I was like, oh, this is wonderful. I get to do more research into these things and find out what was going on. And then as a writer reading it, I'm like, oh, this is so interesting. I get to see what specifically inspired her for each piece in a really literal way. And it's a fascinating kind of way of pulling back the curtain. So I liked it.
Thank you. I've largely heard positive, but I just got one review where somebody just was railing on that. And so I felt like I particularly want to contextualize that, because it isn't common in a poetry collection to have that, but that's particularly why I love the immersion series.
Yeah. One actually that I found myself researching was the Radium Girls, and I'd love to talk more about that poem or that concept, because I feel like it's one of the few poems in the collection where we kind of exit the physical space of Japan and incorporate this kind of oceanic connection between two different cultures. Could you talk a little bit more about how you came to that poem, how you see it fitting into the collection?
That's a great question. And I'm trying to remember how I stumbled on the Radium Girls, because I think that was probably just a whole other research rabbit trail. My mom is like this too, so I guess this is kind of milking a little bit from the last question, but my mom is somebody that just always is reading. In my house, I would look for the cereal in the kitchen, and there'd be the Britlet section and the books. And I'd be like, Mom, where's the cereal? She's like, oh, it's behind Britlet. So I'd have to pull out C.S. Lewis and, Uncle Chambers, and then I'd maybe find some cereal. So my mom is now that, she's figured out how Google works, my mom is kind of a little behind the times. She's constantly researching, and she's like, oh, I spent the last week searching, sailor shanties, songs. And, then when Wellman came out, she learned how to play that on the guitar. So I came from a house that loved learning, and research is just a natural part of life, constantly learning. And so how I found the Radium Girls, I really can't remember. I mean, I probably heard about it at some point briefly in conversation, but I went on a huge research rabbit trail. I was just fascinated. And later I felt that connection with Fukushima, of course, of, radium as part of our everyday life and kind of how our view of it has changed. But when I discovered the Radium Girls, I just was so disturbed by this idea that a company, it's nothing new under the sun, right? This company knew the problems with radium. There was so much cultural lack of knowledge at that time, but the company was starting to see what was happening and knew, oh, wait, maybe we shouldn't have the girls, licking their brushes and putting radium in their mouth every day.
Yeah.
But they did everything to not educate people on that. They did everything to not hold liability, and these girls' bodies were literally disintegrating from radium. And that's just so terrifying. And again, nothing's new under the sun. This still happens. Corporations still, hold valuable information from people, and it costs lives. But that haunted me, but it also haunted me, how the view of things changes, that just, 100 years ago, people consumed radium and thought it was this miracle thing. And now we have a much more full understanding of the complexities of radium and, you know, when it's good and when it's unsafe. And so I think I probably wrote, if I remember right, I wrote about that, but then, you know, Fukushima was also in the back of my mind. And so there became this other section, and then seeing the parallels and thinking, you know, of how, you know, TEPCO dealt with this radium leak, and Japan continues to deal with this radium leak of like, oh, it's fine, you know, and there's so many things that are kind of censored and erased from the people of, you know, there are perhaps more lasting consequences than we're talking about. History repeating itself. And so those patterns fascinate and haunt me. This is why we have to talk about histories, because this stuff is still happening. And until we kind of acknowledge what's happened in the past, how are we going to be able to deal with it in the future? Yeah,
absolutely. Wow. Yeah, I think that poem in particular felt like an opening in a really fascinating way. And I wanted to talk to you more. I know you mentioned people are always like, how do you write about the same thing? Do you find that like this collection has encapsulated a lot of your thoughts, and for your next collection, you might move on to something else? Or do you feel continually haunted and like you might want to return to these topics?
That's a great question. Because, you know, as a writer, you want to think, I wrote this thing and I published this thing and now I'm done with that thing, I'm going to move on. And to some degree it happens. There's a level of closure once you complete a collection and somebody acknowledges that it feels complete, you know?
Yeah, absolutely.
And it goes out into the world. So I don't know, but part of me.
Okay, yeah. You don't need to know. You don't need to know.
Well, it's funny that you asked it, because I think I ask myself that a lot. I don't think I write many more poems about this, but I have still, of course, been so haunted by this stuff, and it's trickled into my fiction. There's been a fiction project on and off that's really been inspired by, especially the Fukushima element and kind of the censorship of a country about something that's unknown, which then of course when COVID happened, I was like, oh, this is a little too real, like I can't quite touch it, because then it just basically became a metaphor for COVID. And it was like, that's not quite what I mean, but again, history repeats itself. So these things, you know, continuously happen. There's things that are uncomfortable and we don't like to talk about them. And so it's often easier. So I think in short, like there's certain thematic things that will probably continue to come into my work, but it's probably going to be in a different way. Like that's probably going to be a little, like I didn't really talk I don't feel like I went too deep into the interrogating governments aspect. Like that was definitely something in the back of my mind through a lot of this, but I don't think my poems really did that. So maybe at some point there's going to be a fiction piece that really savagely digs into that and critiques that.
Yeah. Yeah, that feels like the ultimate experimentation with form of like, I've done a haiku, I've done a chart, I'm doing fiction now. Right. It's expanded, it's grown.
Right. Well, and they do different things. Like each medium does something different. And so until all those aspects that I want to talk about are out, you know, they'll probably find some place in some writing that they'll come out of.
Yeah, excellent. Another thing that really interested me about the collection is the difference in speaker. I really love the poem where like we hear directly from the cows. I don't know if you get that a lot, but I'd love to hear more about your experimentation with speaker too. I know some poets like to kind of speak from a consistent voice, and I feel like you're very experimental in so many ways.
Yeah, so one of the first collections that really blew my mind to what poetry could be was Patricia Smith's Blood Dazzler. That was a collection I had to read in college, I guess a community college. And I was just blown away by how she talked about disaster and how she let different objects speak for disasters. The Superdome has a voice, you know, the president has a voice, the dude that owns his dog and is like, oh, my dog's gonna be fine. There were all these different voices, and I was like, this is so cool. This is what poems can do. You can just like really go wild. And so I was definitely constantly thinking about that collection as I worked on this, of, you know, what voices could speak, how can I view the disaster from a different angle. You know, I'm fascinated by kind of Japan, deep cultural Japan, how they view spirits and objects, especially dolls. And so I was like, you know, what would it be like for a doll that didn't get funeral rites? Because they really, you bring your dolls to the local Jinja temple, you know, and they do burial rites for it because of this possibility for a spirit being in it. And so I was just like, you know, how would a doll feel being abandoned and not getting that closure because of disaster? And, you know, how would this building feel being the last building standing? It's just like, it's a really fun thought experiment. And it really, I think, opens your eyes to new realizations about a disaster. I think it opens up empathy. I think everyone should play with different perspectives to some degree in writing. I think we have all sorts of conversations right now of who's allowed to write what, and those are really important conversations. And I think especially when we publish something, we have to really think about that and have really careful conversations of what do we publish. But the act of writing something from something in a new perspective, I think it really opens up empathy, because we have to really think outside of our own way of thinking, and we're talking about this kind of in the way of point of view with objects, I guess, because a lot of the things I did were objects. But even that opens up empathy, because you have to think differently.
Yeah, absolutely.
And you have to do research of like, how would this person think, or how would this object think? And so I think that that's just a good human being exercise to do. But for the collection, I think it just allowed me to open up new possibilities of what I talked about in relation to disaster. And it was just an interesting way to think of these objects think.
Yeah, absolutely. And thinking about that difference in perspective, or who's allowed to publish what, have you noticed a difference in the way Japanese readers, or let's say American readers, have received the collection?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. And I think I'm not sure. I'm afraid of overgeneralizing. But one of the critiques I did get was from, I believe, an American that lives in Japan. And so their perspective is different from, a native Japanese person that lives in Japan versus an American that lives in America versus maybe ethnically Japanese person that lives in America. So I think largely the collection has received very positive feedback. But I think that there's certain populations I'm not necessarily hearing as consistently from. So I don't want to speak for them of, how they feel about the collection. So I don't want to say any generalizations. I've been appreciative for the positive feedback I've gotten. I've been appreciative for the criticisms I've gotten. And I've just done the best I can as somebody that, I'm not ethnically Japanese, but Japan has been a part of basically my entire life. So like, how can I not write about Japan? When this happened, I was grieved. To me, this was my country in a certain way. That's oversimplifying talking about that way, but it was part of me. Like Japan,
yeah, absolutely.
And so I grieved, and I was like, I can't not think about this. I can't not write about this. This is a part of my life, and these are my people. To some level. So I'm afraid of saying anything, because I'm afraid it's easy for something to be taken out of context. But I hope that answers the question. I don't know how to give the best answer. Just that, it's a complicated thing, and there's going to be complicated views, I think. And I respect that. I think there's a lot of valid responses to this collection. None of them are wrong.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So for our Authors Corner project in general, we're promoting authors who have published with small indie presses. Could you talk us through your publication process?
Yeah, so I did what every poet does, of kind of play the poetry lottery to some degree. I'm really not into the poetry lottery of spend $30 to maybe win one prize. I know why the system's like that. But yeah, it's not my thing. So I tended to send a lot more to places that didn't have a submission fee, or had a submission fee where I got something for it, a subscription, a copy of a book. And this is one I stumbled on. The immersion series just started, and they explained what it was. And I was like, well, I think I can make a case for how this is, educating people about Japan, educating people about a historic event and disaster and things like that. And so I wrote together a letter, and actually that process of writing a letter justifying why it should be in the series, I think, was a culminating element where I really had to think about this collection and what I'm trying to do with the collection. And so that was where it got accepted. Before that, it had gotten, like many, like a finalist, semi-finalists, lots of people expressing interest, but no quite a bite. And I always submit too early, so I sent it way earlier than it should have been. And, like it wasn't really a collection, but I was like, this is the best thing ever, and it still needed a lot of work. So there was, of course, lots of rejection, lots of hopeful notes, until eventually it found the right home. And I'm just so grateful. It went with Press 53. They're a really great press. Chris has just put so much care into this collection with editing. He was paying more attention, I felt like, that I did to certain craft elements. He's like, I noticed insert really specific thing about what these poems are doing. And I was like, wow, I totally didn't think about that, but I'll pretend. So
Yeah.
but I'm happy to talk more about specific elements of small press because I also worked with small press for my novel. So I love working with small presses, but yeah.
Yeah, no, that's wonderful. I'd love to hear more about, I think a lot of authors publishing with small presses have really varying relationships with like the promotion process. How much of that falls on the press, how much of that falls on the author. What was like the promotion process or getting this book out into the world process like for you?
It was nice because Press 53 offered to do more than has been offered in my experience. I mean, I typically am used to just being my promotion team, and then anything that the press does is bonus. And I think it's probably the right attitude to go into it with, because I see people sometimes go in with unrealistic expectations, thinking like, my press is going to do all this stuff, and they're probably not. So the more you do, that's going to help your book. So it was relatively collaborative, where I would communicate where I wanted stuff set, and often they would send the book copies out for me, which was great. And we talked about a couple other things where I could get some more arcs, and maybe they'd help a little bit with a fee or something like that. So that was really helpful, collaborating with them in that way. But I mean, still, there's so much that the author does on their own. A lot of contacting people in your circles that might be able to review it or post about it or things like that. So there was a little bit of both. But I think Press 53 always expressed, that they'd be happy to help, like just communicate with us what you would want and how we do that. So I felt very comfortable that we could have those conversations and that they did help a lot, especially with getting a lot of those book copies out to people.
Yeah, absolutely. Another aspect of publications, just like a personal interest of mine, is cover art.
Yes.
And I'd love to hear more about how the cover for this collection came together.
That was great because it was collaborative again, because I hear some people say, I found my book cover because I Googled my book one day and there was my cover. So this was nice that we got to talk about, because Chris picked some images at the beginning and Franco was like, I'm not vibing with those. Though it was on the right track, like he was thinking about the right thematic sort of things, but we both kind of searched for images that we liked, and we really just loved this because it gets at kind of the Shinto kind of spiritual aspects that are kind of pulled in, and the folklore with the kitsune there, with the light in the forest. So it gave kind of that mixing of worlds that I wanted. And so I'm glad we both agreed on it, because it could have been, I loved that and he hated it. And
yeah,
so it was really nice that we were able to collaborate and be able to find something we both really liked.
Yeah, well, congratulations. It's very exciting. Yeah, I know. I've talked to authors who were just like, I don't know. I didn't get it. So that's really lovely.
Well, and as somebody, I hand sell a lot. I go to a lot of conventions and sell my book. And, I was like really insistent, I've got to have a good cover. And I've seen covers I really don't like. And, the cover is everything when you're hand selling, when there's hundreds of tables and, people, they need to be hooked by a cover and want to know more. So I was very like, we got to find something we both like, because I'm not going to feel like I can hand sell a book where I don't like the cover.
Yeah, absolutely. I respect that so much. Okay, well, it's been so lovely talking to you today, Meg. Thank you so much for your time. Could you tell our viewers where on the internet they can find you if they want more Meg Eden?
Well, you can find me on megedenbooks.com, my website that's got all sorts of info. I'm sometimes on Twitter as Confused Narwhal. I'm sometimes on Instagram as _author. But you can always reach out to me on my website. That's probably the most consistent way to get a hold of me.
Okay, excellent. And you can find all of our links, The Inner Loop, in the bio. You can find us on Facebook at The Inner Loop and on Instagram and Twitter at The Inner Loop Lit. Thank you. Articles, interviews, watch her podcast episodes, watch. Oh my God, I need to get this. Okay, what? I should just take the freaking notes. See, I should just write it down. Okay, here we go.